Good morning, everybody. This is Father Scott, and this is your first lesson in Anglo-Saxon literature. So we spoke about this kind of briefly when we gave a timeline of all of British literature, but from roughly 45 BC to about the middle of the 5th century, so let's say 450 AD, Rome occupied Britain. And then around 450, the barbarians had come into mainland Europe, continental Europe, and they caused a great deal of strife and turmoil for the Europeans who were there, and the Roman Empire drew everybody back from their further out colonies and brought them back home so that they could reinforce the heart of the empire, which devastated England. England was left without any economic superstructure, any military superstructure. A huge percentage of their population just left. And it created this power vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum, so into that vacuum came the Vikings, the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. Legends and some history that comes from a few hundred years later talk about two Saxon warlords whose names were Horsa and Hengist. And Horsa and Hengist were terrible warlords who did all sorts of things that they'd be considered war crimes today in any court. But what they did was they came in and they took over and they did horrible things. And in response to this, a British warlord chief with claimed ties to the Romans, he rises up from sort of the west in either Wales or Cornwall, and he mounts a defense against them, drives them back, succeeds in fighting 12 battles against them, and that is whom we know as King Arthur. Now, was he really a king? It's probably something more like a chieftain rather than a king, but he comes from this time. Now, a lot of what we get about Arthur that follows comes from much later events. Okay, some of them aren't even English; they're French legends that are told by the troubadours that travel around and sing their songs to make money. But King Arthur would have been in the time period of the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, so just give you some context there. Let's talk about some characteristics of Anglo-Saxon literature, of Old English literature, before we get started. So it's kind of a mistake to think that all poetry looks like what we think of when we see poetry today, that it has a certain meter, that it rhymes. And that's typically what we think of when we think of modern poetry. But it's not really the case with all forms of poetry. Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme at all. They're all about structure and how the lines are put together and what letters each line begins with. That's kind of their thing. Japanese poetry is about the length of words as opposed to counting syllables, and they don't rhyme at all. So rhyme and meter are not necessarily essential. When we're talking about Anglo-Saxon poetry, there's really kind of three things that are the defining characteristics. One is alliteration. Now, alliteration is the repeated sound of the first consonant of a word. So an example of alliteration would be, she sells seashells down by the seashore. You didn't think I could do that, did you? Well, that's alliteration. You've got the repeated S sound and the SH sound, so that's an example of alliteration. As you read through the poetry that you're going to be doing this week, be on the lookout for alliteration, okay, because it's going to happen a lot. In some of the works that you're going to read, this isn't going to be apparent because when they translate it, they render it out. But in others, you're going to see this device called a Caesura. And a Caesura is basically a break in the middle of a line. So what you will have is you will have someone who writes half a line, and then it looks like they skip 5 5 to 10 spaces, and they resume the line. Okay, there's nothing missing in this. Part of their poetic feature was this Caesura, and so they'd say part of it, and they'd keep going, and they'd do the next part. In some of the pieces that you'll read, they number the lines, and you'll see 4A. Okay, well, if there's 4A, there's probably a 4B, and that's actually, in fact, what it happens. Rather than having them printed on the same line with like the first half and the second half, they have one that goes under the other. And they're really one line, and they should be textually printed up like this, but the one goes under, and so you've got the two lines like that. When you read from the book of Exeter, the riddles about war and battle and weapons, you can really clearly see there's a Caesura in the middle of the lines there, as it should be. Now, that's not an audible break when you're reading them. If you're reading them aloud, you shouldn't say, like, I think that I shall never see a thing as lovely as a tree. There's no need to do an audible break. That's an actual poem, by the way, not mine. So you don't need to pause verbally when you're saying it. You just read through it. It has to do with the number of beats in the first half and the second half. But the problem is, as it was written in Old English or Anglo-Saxon, it's been translated to a point where we can't really discern those beats, and so looking at it in modern English, you can't tell. So that's alliteration, Caesura, and the third device is something called a kenning. Now, a kenning is a metaphorical way of talking about something while not actually naming it. So I think part of this is poetic, and part of it is probably superstitious. Perhaps you may have heard the phrase, speak of the devil. Well, the second half of that is speak of the devil and he shall appear. And it's sort of an old warning not to say the devil's name, not to talk about the devil. And they had this idea that if you said certain things, especially things that were powerful or dangerous, that you would either jinx yourself or those around you, or you would summon them. Okay? And as a result, they didn't talk about them with specific direct terms. They didn't name them. So they have these things that are called kennings, which are poetic, maybe superstitious ways of talking about them without actually calling them by name. So, for example, we see an example of a kenning where something is referred to as the whale road, not the railroad, the whale road. And this is a way of talking about the ocean, the road where the whales travel. There is also a reference to something being called a foe biter, something that bites your foe. Well, that's a reference to your sword. Okay, so there's a couple of these that you'll see. Sometimes they're glossed over and they explain them, sometimes they don't. But this was very common in broader Anglo-Saxon literature. So be on the lookout for alliteration, be on the lookout for Caesura, and be on the lookout for kennings. Okay? Those are the three defining features of Anglo-Saxon poetry. In the comments below, you will have your assignments for the week. Some of them are videos, some of them are links to things that I want you to read. Okay? So the first thing that you're going to see is a YouTube video that is the Lord's Prayer in Old English or Anglo-Saxon. The neat thing about this is that it gives you the Old English text, the Anglo-Saxon text, and while it is reading it as it would have sounded, it actually highlights the sections and says, this is our Father, this is who art in heaven. Okay? So it allows you to more easily follow along with it and try and make some sense of things that are really not going to make sense. And you'll see that, man, even the letters are different. Okay? So that's first. You've got the Lord's Prayer in Old English, and then you've got a set of riddles that are set in modern English. And the answers are down at the bottom, so when you look at it and go, I have no idea what this is, scroll down at the bottom, you can see them. Following that, you have section 8 from the Book of Exeter, which is a collection of riddles. It's our biggest collection of Anglo-Saxon riddles. And the really fascinating thing about this is it has the original text with the Caesuras in Old English or Anglo-Saxon, and then beside that it has a modern translation so you can understand it, and then below that it has some commentary on it, which is really helpful. You can look at other things in the Book of Exeter, but this is a pretty good, concise, hey, these make a lot of sense. Some of them, to us, they're just really foreign and they don't make a lot of sense. After that, you've got two different Anglo-Saxon poems. One is called The Seafarer, and the other is called The Wanderer. After you read those two poems, those are a little bit longer poems, so they're about 150 lines each. It shouldn't take you too long to read them. Maybe you can read one a day. Following that, we have possibly the oldest Christian hymn in anything resembling the English language. This is called Caedmon's Hymn. Maybe you've heard of a worship band called Caedmon's Call. Caedmon's Hymn is probably written around the 700s. So you're looking at a 1,300-year-old poem. And it's written in Old English, but it's a hymn in praise of God. So you've got two links to that. The first is a text that has the Old English version and then the modern translation, so I want you to watch both of those. But there's a video at the top. Don't watch the video, okay? It's like some auto-tuned voice that just, automatic computer voice that just reads it out. So it's like 4,7 years ago. Don't listen to that. It's dumb, okay? But the second one, the second link on Caedmon's Hymn is a video that's actually really good. It's high quality, except for this weird picture of a guy at the end. But that's just kind of silliness. So read it, see what the Old English looks like. You're not going to be able to understand it at all. And then read the modern version, and then go back and watch the video. Okay? So those are the things that I want you to do. You're going to do the Lord's Prayer. You're going to read these two different kinds of these riddles. You're going to read the Seafarer, the Wanderer, and Caedmon's Hymn. And be sure that you have all of this done. Frankly, I don't care if you do it all on Monday, but be sure that you get all of it done by Tuesday. And we will talk about it briefly and go from there. Next week, we'll be working on Beowulf. So, thank you very much, guys. God bless, and I will see you on Tuesday.